desirable, how successful, how rare, how accomplished you are, is the validation from other people. Not just women, but people. So let's talk again about the difference between sobriety and recovery, because there are some guys who need to kind of fast forward the whole sobriety process and just skip straight to recovery. I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. So the reason I'm doing this again, I have these calls where I bring all of my groups together, and so all the guys in the different groups get to interact with each other. And we were talking about recovery plans. So I asked for a volunteer. And I said, hey, read me your recovery plan. Now, this was a new guy to one of my groups, but he has been in recovery for, I think 3 or 4 years, right? And so he proceeded to describe to me his recovery plan, right? So he talked about how many meetings he's attending. He's talking about his different check-ins that he does with his wife. He has a morning routine, right, where he's kind of reaching out to a couple of the guys in his recovery circles. He has these like little check-ins that he does with himself throughout the day just to kind of see where his head's at, right, to keep him safe. And then he talked about some monthly practices, quarterly practices, and annual practices, right? I appreciated all of it. But I stopped and I said, that sounds like a lot of sobriety planning. What's your recovery plan? I always feel a little bad doing that because I don't mean to take anything away from him, embarrass him. It was just, I think a lot of people forget that there is a difference between sobriety and recovery. So let's speak to that for a second. What do I mean by that? Well, sobriety is not doing the unwanted behavior. So a sobriety plan would be anything that basically prevents it, slows it down, gives you more time to think, have these little check-ins throughout the day so that you don't find yourself, kind of compulsively or addictively engaging in one of these behaviors, right? So it's a lot of like barriers, right? Check-ins, calls, like a blocker or something on their electronic devices, right? So those will be sobriety issues, right? So we're slowing down and or stopping, prohibiting, or making the behavior less likely to occur. But that's not recovery. And that's very, very important to see that distinction because, like for example, 12-step. 12-step is a abstinence-based program. That's what it is, right? The goal is sobriety, not recovery, right? There's no therapist on site, right? There's no crosstalk allowed, right? So it's a sobriety tool, and it can absolutely assist in recovery. So I want to make sure everybody understands that. It's not like there's this definitive line, this is sobriety, this is recovery. I would say there's aspects of our sobriety plan that certainly contribute to our recovery. So again, there is some carryover there. But I would definitely say a recovery plan looks very, very different. And I'm going to say right now, for the betrayed partners listening to this, your husband's going to kill me, but I'm not that impressed with a lot of guys' recovery plans. A lot of guys have sobriety plans, but they don't have recovery plans. And here's why that matters. It's recovery that helps us go the distance, right? Even when guys say long-term sobriety, I would kind of erase that from your vocabulary. That to me sounds like white knuckling it, right? That sounds to me like, a lot of the stuff hasn't changed. You just have all these things in place to prevent you from doing it. But what happens when those things can't be done? Or you're in an environment where, again, you don't have the time, right? You're traveling for work and you're in this situation and you can't do your sobriety stuff. What, you relapse? And that's what the statistics would show, right? The relapse rate's insanely high in this field. And so I'm going to call attention to recovery plans. Let me give you some examples of this, right? So a recovery plan would be something that you're doing that's actually changing the root cause of your acting out behaviors. You've actually figured out the ins and outs of your particular process addiction, and you're actually going through and seeing, okay, if somebody's engaging in those processes, why would they? Why would they find value in that? Right? And so that's figuring out what kind of person would find value in engaging in behavior like that. What is the perceived value? What is the wound or the deficit or the discrepancy that you're feeling that's making you want to act out, right? The brain's basically believing that the acting out behavior is going to solve this deficit, this unmet need, whatever it is. So a recovery plan would be undoing those things. So I'm going to give you some examples. I'm going to use myself as an example. I don't mean to always talk about myself. It's a lot easier to talk about my own recovery than it is to talk about someone else's recovery because I haven't done the recovery, I just done mine. One of my biggest pathologies, the thing that really drove most of my sexual acting out was my superiority complex. I want to be special. I want to be better. I want people to look at me, admire me, tell me how great I am, flatter me. I know it makes me sound like a narcissistic, self-absorbed individual, but I don't know what else to say. That's the truth of it. I wanted to be special. I wanted to be admired. I wanted to be validated. I wanted people to tell me how great I was. I wanted to be the fanciest specialist guy in the room, right? So unfortunately, as our society has kind of evolved, women have gotten roped into that, right? And that's why, again, I have a hard time calling myself a sex addict or a porn addict. I am not addicted to sex. I'm not addicted to porn. I actually really don't crave sex and porn that often, which is funny, right? Because this is a sex addiction podcast. But what I mean by that is my true addiction is validation, feeling special. And unfortunately, women have gotten roped into that, right? So our society has basically shown on television and media that the attention from attractive women is valuable. It must mean that you are an accomplished, desirable male, right? And so I really latched onto that. And that started early. I would say I started really kind of figuring that out in middle school, right? Where all the, macho, good-looking, athletic guys were the ones able to get the most attractive girls, right? And then my attempts to get them failed. I wasn't athletic. I was socially awkward. I was not confident, right? And so I kind of developed this complex around, a fear almost of, am I special? Does anyone care about me? Am I going to die alone? Am I ever going to get married? Am I going to have to settle for a woman that I really don't want, but because I can't get the one that I want, I have to just compromise my standards, right? And so these were all these fears, right? So this is kind of the basis of process addiction. And again, for those of you who have not listened, either read my book or listened to my podcast before, sex addiction, porn addiction, they are process addictions. That's how they're classified. So you really need to figure out the brain process that you're engaging in when you're doing these unwanted behaviors, right? And in my case, it was fishing for validation, compliments, attention, right? That's really what I wanted. And it wasn't just women. There were plenty of times where I actually could have probably had a sexual encounter or something in that ballpark. And I chose not to because there were actually men, high net worth men, billionaires, other influencers in my industry who were like, hey, Roland, do you want to, go to the cigar bar? And I left all these ladies and went to the cigar bar because the approval and the attention and being in the inner circle with the elites in our industry was more validating than sex. So again, the reason I bring that up is, if I was a sex addict, wouldn't I have chosen the women over the men? Right. And so that's where I figured out, a lot of my process addiction was being special, being validated. Right. And again, unfortunately, sex appeal, being desired, because women are 50% of the population, they're everywhere. And if that's an avenue that you choose, there is the potential that you're going to choose that avenue. Right. Whereas finding an influential position to impress a guy, that's less common. Right. You can't really just go out and find that and engineer that. But women, you can. Right. So eventually, when you start craving these moments of validation, attention, feeling special, feeling wanted, feeling desired, you're going to go to wherever you can get that. And unfortunately, once guys kind of crack the door to using women for that, once that door's opened, it usually stays open, unfortunately, and it gets worse and worse. So my recovery plan, so I would need both, right? I would need a sobriety plan, sure, to keep myself safe, right? So if I'm going to a work conference, I need to be aware of these things. So what am I going to do? I'm not going to drink alcohol. That's just going to increase the likelihood of me violating my integrity, right? So alcohol's gone. I need to be hyper aware, right? When I'm going into a happy hour, dinner, a networking situation, I need to assess the situation and ask myself, is this a room somebody like me with my pathology should be in? If I'm craving attention, does this look like an environment where I'm going to be able to do that and maybe do it in an unhealthy way, right? So I really have to be honest with myself. I have to look at the situation and gauge how risky it is. For those of you listening, the guys who go to conferences, usually the first happy hour is the safe happy hour, maybe the second. But when you go to the third, and it gets later and later in the evening, you do have to ask yourself, is this a safe environment for somebody like me with my process addiction, right? So that would be a sobriety plan, right? I'm checking in with my wife. I'm having my location on my phone. If you don't want to drink, I know a lot of guys who will tell one of their colleagues, hey, I don't want to drink tonight. I have this bad habit of just grabbing a free beer, and next thing you know, I'm drinking my third or fourth beer. I don't want to drink tonight. So please, if somehow I have a beer in my hand, have me put it down. That would be a sobriety plan. Right? So what would a recovery plan be? Well, a recovery plan, that's going to happen outside of these events on my own time, right? Why do I need validation from other people? Why can't I validate myself? Why do I need it from women? Of what significance is this woman going to give me? Like her attention, what does that earn me? Seriously, what does that earn me? Does that make me a better father? Does that make me a more influential? It doesn't. Her liking my, blazer and her, liking my attention and us having this, what's that actually do though for my life? Right? So recovery is really kind of examining the process in the first place and just being like, why are you doing this? So what, you're going to go flirt with her and what, harm your marriage? Or even worse, sleep with her and wind up divorced, right? Lose all the respect from your kids, right? Are your kids ever going to talk to you again when they find out how many times you've cheated on your wife? Again, we just have to examine this process because, to empathize with addicts in that moment, you're using a lot of the brain processes that you've seen on TV. I have a lot of empathy for guys. I mean, guys, you are victims of this. You are. And I know the betrayed partners, it's hard to hear that because of what we've done to our wives and the ugliness of, we basically just ruined these poor women, right? Their recovery is 20 times harder than ours. They're certainly victims. But I would also say, guys, you're victims of this too. And what I mean by that is, the media portraying and TV shows, watch all these shows. These guys have side chicks all the time, right? The wealthier and more powerful the guy, the more women are constantly shown being lusted after this guy, and it's been going on, right? The Sopranos, right? Tony Soprano has always got him and all his friends have the side girls, right? They even conduct their business out of a strip club. I don't know if you guys remember that. James Bond, right? Is James Bond a monogamous man who's committed to his wife and his kids? No, right? So we constantly, Batman is single and, he's obsessed with Rachel, but he's constantly being lusted after by all of these super attractive women. So the point is, all through middle school, all through high school, all through college, the emphasis, all the guys are trying to sleep with attractive women, right? So there's this emphasis on, that's how you know how manly you are. That's how you know how desirable, how successful, how rare, how accomplished you are, is the validation from other people. Not just women, but people. And so a recovery plan would be undoing that, right? So that would be first examining what is admiration, what is respect, and how does one earn it, right? And really examining, is my plan actually how one earns respect? Look at what happened to Tiger Woods. I don't know. Sure looked like it ruined his legacy to me, right? So why do you think that this is a good plan, right? Other pieces in that would be the objectification of women, right? Have you examined how using a person for self-gain, how selfish and self-centered and mean and degrading that really is, right? Have you examined that, what you're doing? Because you're not disclosing to these women, hey, I'm going to use you tonight for your attention and your validation, and I'm going to say things to get you to say nice things about me. We never say that. If you did, she'd walk away from you. But again, that's what you're doing, right? We have this manipulative plan that we're using people, right? So a recovery plan would be, how do I stop manipulating others? How do I validate myself rather than constantly needing external validation? It would also be, why do I feel like there's more for me to accomplish? Why am I not okay and just good enough the way that I am on this trajectory, right? Whatever it is. I mean, obviously every guy has a different trigger as to why they would then go need validation, but that's your work. That's your recovery work, right? There's a Rolandism that I say in my recovery work groups. You can't recover unless you know what you're recovering from. I'm going to say that again because it's incredibly important. You can't recover unless you know what you're recovering from, right? So you need to figure out, what is this pathology? What in my environment, how I'm feeling, triggers me feeling like I am not enough, no one's paying attention to me, and then you go fishing for, again, these compliments, these successes, these accolades, these moments where people are telling you how great you are, right? Moments in time where you're able to prove that you're better than others, right? But there's so much flaws in what I said. There's so much flaws in that, right? Constantly trying to be better than others. Who wants to hang around that guy, right? So again, recovery work is just really testing your processes, testing them for insanity, testing them for the fact that are they really going to get you what you're after and what you want? So that would just be one example of one of my pathologies. I'm not going to go on in others, but I'll give you just a couple more examples, right? So lying. Right? Lying would be a pathology, right? And there's different forms of lying, right? There's people who, the objective is to control their life. They want to control outcomes. And so they use lying, manipulation, omitting the truth, bending the truth. They use all these things to craft an outcome, right? We call it image management. Come on, it's lying. That's what it is. You're trying to craft a way of being so that people think a certain thing about you and say certain things about you, right? What's another example? Another example would be people pleasing, right? This obsession with the most important thing you can do is make someone like you, make someone be impressed with you. But again, what's the flaw with that? Every single person has a different definition of what's impressive. So you basically have to just become a full-time sellout and impress the people in front of you. That's your only option because, again, this person will admire the guy who's strong in his faith. And so now you have to be a guy who's strong in his faith. Then you go over to this guy, and this guy's impressed by your muscles and how many attractive women you can get, right? So now you got to impress him. Meanwhile, violating your values, your religious beliefs, right? And so it's just this madness, right? It's a double life, a triple life, a quadruple life. Anyways, these are just some examples. My point is, a recovery plan is You going in and watching that addictive or compulsive process, right? Your process addiction, and coming through and making sure, have I changed that? Because if you haven't changed it, you're not in recovery, and you're certainly not recovered, and you might not even be on the road to recovery, right? If you're just leaning on sobriety practices, and that's all you're doing, is just barriers, check-ins, popping in meetings. If you haven't changed the core of the process, why is your wife supposed to believe that it's not going to happen again, right? And these ladies are smart, right? They're not stupid. They can see, they start to figure your process addiction out, especially at post-discovery. And so they're wanting to see that change. And for those of you who are trying to rebuild trust within your relationship, it's your ability to identify, police, and change your process addiction that will actually build trust with your wife, right? Because blind trust is gone. She's not going to just sit back and say, oh, I trust him, he'll never do this again. That's a thing of the past. Where she will start to regain trust is when it's like, you know what? I trust him to keep himself safe. I trust him to keep our family safe because he knows what his pathology is. He's working with his recovery group. He has a peer group. In my groups, the reason I keep the group sizes small and I keep you with the same 10 men the whole time is because once they figure out your process addiction, and they come down on you, they're hard on you in a loving way. But basically, I don't call my groups, if you go to my website, I don't call my groups sobriety groups because they're not. I actually say on my website, you need to have some decent sobriety under your belt before you get into my groups. I don't want to play the whole sobriety game. Go take care of that and then come into my groups when you're actually trying to change this thing and get out of your life. Now, last thing I wanted to say was, in the beginning, I said some guys kind of need to fast forward, sobriety and kind of, not skip to, but hurry up and just kind of start crafting a recovery plan. I mean, you can't recover without sobriety, right? You need sobriety. A lot of the guys in my groups, they're not really sex addicts and porn addicts in that very traditional sense, in the sense that, to be an addict, you can't stop. My guys can. I would say probably 70% of the guys in my group, when they get caught, they stop. Even after the grief phase wears off, there's not this massive urge to go back to it. Are they addicted? I don't know. I think they kind of fall more into that compulsive category, right? Where they're just violating their morals and values rather than having an addiction. So why do I say that? Well, because if you're not addicted, if you've just had 6 or 7 affairs over the last 10 years, and you've had periods of time where you're not having an affair, and then you got caught and you had really no problem stopping having affairs, you're not an addict, just by definition, right? So again, hanging out, these guys, it always kind of is funny to me when I see them I ask them, hey, what are you doing in your recovery? And they're just naming off all these sobriety. Oh, I'm going to 2 12-step meetings a week. I've got these blockers here. I've got these check-ins. I've got a sponsor. It's cool. And again, I'm not asking them to stop any of that. But you kind of weren't really an addict anyways, right? Stopping wasn't necessarily that big of an issue for you. And so obsession with sobriety, I think a lot of that energy would be better channeled in just kind of getting right back to what's the root cause of this? How do I change some of this stuff? So hopefully that makes sense. So again, both are necessary. I agree with, everyone's state, and it's true, right? You can't really recover if you're not sober or you're still engaging in these behaviors. But again, we do need to ultimately recover. And that is the solution. Sobriety isn't the solution. Sobriety is a Band-Aid, right? Sobriety is how we keep ourselves safe. Sobriety is how we stay positioned to be able to do recovery. So again, sobriety technically is actually number one. Not because it's actually number one. It's number one because you can't do the recovery work without ceasing the behaviors. But again, for the guys listening to this who really had not a hard time stopping, how much energy do we put into this addiction that you might not have even had? You might have fallen more into that compulsive category. And if you did, let's get on to the recovery stuff, right? Let's change this. Because again, if you don't change it, you're going to do it again. And that's why we see this relapse rate so high in this field is we can't just play in sobriety land. Eventually, we need to undo the brain processes that drove all this behavior in the first place. So for those of you who have not read my book, a great place to kind of wrap your head around recovery is my book, right? It's the High Achiever's Guide to Sex Addiction Recovery. It's on Amazon. It's also on Audible. I read it myself with my voice. For some people, that matters. So check out my book. And then obviously just go back through my podcast. I talk about this thing like it is, like it's classified in the American Psychological Association. It's a process addiction. That's how this is classified. So really, if you're not examining your processes, you haven't mastered what they are, and you certainly haven't talked to your therapist or your CSAT about how to undo some of those processes, how to change that identity of yours that relies on these things. Again, are you in recovery? And I don't mean this in any disrespect. My mission is to put an end to relapsing, put an end to broken families, put an end to, you break your wife's heart a second time. It is hard. You break at a third, I mean, for the ladies listening to this, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, it's just devastating. So again, I'm not coming down on you guys to bust your balls and make you feel like you're not in great recovery. Or, I just want to make sure that more families don't get ruined through relapses, that you guys actually get to a safe and healthy place where your brain has changed rather than you just finding a way to stop the behaviors.